the Theology Journal to discuss the topic Gender, Ecology, and Religions, a queer ecofeminist proposal for climate justice and gender justice. I'd like to present to everyone Dr. Sharon A. Bong.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bartholomew, for that introduction. Let me begin my presentation. I'm honored to have received this invite to serve as a panelist in the webinar on ecofeminism in an Asian context by Dr. Father Anthony Leduc, who is Executive Director of the Asian Research Center for Religion and Social Communication at St. John's University, Thailand. I wish to also congratulate the organizers on foregrounding the theology and practice of feminists, because engaging with feminists is a risky business. The questions that each of us were given that frame tonight's webinar include: what are the major elements and concerns of Asian ecofeminism? What are the challenges to ecofeminism in the Asian milieu? And what are the manifestations of Asian ecofeminism in the life of the people? How can Asian ecofeminism contribute to the regional and global discourse on environmental safeguarding? It's really heartening for me to know that ecofeminism is not something that is passé. And I hope my presentation that is titled Gender, Ecology, and Religions, a queer proposal for climate justice and gender justice, will be insightful to your theology and praxis. And this presentation is based on my current research project on queer ecofeminisms in Southeast Asia. So I've been really enlightened by both of the presenters' presentations before me. Having worked with feminist theories for almost 3 decades, as applied to literary studies, followed by religious studies, gender studies, and sexuality studies, I've come to value the concept of intersectionality across these different areas of studies and concerns. In feminist discourse, we generally attribute the concept to Kimberly Crenshaw, who looks at the multiple axes of power and oppression in relation to African American women, who are discriminated against not just on the basis of gender, but also race and class. So an intersectional approach works from this interlocking nexus. Intersectionality recognizes that gender, race, class are mutually constitutive or impacting. Intersections is essentially how I'm framing my presentation this evening. In the first part of the presentation, I unpack some of the key terms used and explain why eco-theologies, which is the intersection of ecology and religion, is insightful. In the second part of my presentation, I argue, as most feminist eco-theologians do, that it is necessary to gender Christian eco-theologies, in particular, that tend to be gender blind or gender biased. And in the final part of the presentation, I showcase lived experiences and ecological practices drawn from Christianity in tandem with other religions and spiritualities that offer a way forward in realizing the vision of an integral ecology. My concluding remarks explain how this is a queer proposal. So this is the first part of my presentation, and the image on the left, as some of you may recognize, is a forest or ecological monk in Thailand, and he is ordaining a tree by wrapping the saffron robe around the tree trunk in order to protect it from loggers. So the first premise that I borrow from indigenous wisdom is that the human person and non-human ecosystem are not just interconnected, but are one. All nature has inherent value and is sacred. The human population, our lifestyles, modes of consumption of food, water, and energy has adversely affected the environment. And in this age of the Anthropocene, the human-driven ecological damage that is mostly irreversible in turn impacts the well-being of the human and other living entities. As an example, one among many, microplastics are in the food that we digest, the air that we breathe, and the water we drink as plastics clog up our oceans. The second premise is the thesis of this research project, that religions and spiritualities are a potential source and resource in realizing climate justice and gender justice. So most of the time, the framing of environmental work is a secular one. I don't mean to imply that those who do not have a religious affiliation are less likely to be environmentally conscious, nor do I mean to imply that those among us who have a religious affiliation are more likely to be environmentally conscious. But by foregrounding the stories of faith-based activists or environmentalists from religious and lay communities, as I will do this evening, I hope to add on to emerging research on this important intersection of gender, ecology, and religion. The second intersection that I consider is climate justice and gender justice. On the left, we have a definition of a climate justice framework, which is a rights-based framework that foregrounds the question of equity between developed countries in the north and developing countries in the global south. All countries are held accountable by a common responsibility to reduce greenhouse emissions, but differentiated responsibilities arises as richer countries that emit more greenhouse gases are in a position to help developing countries through financing and transfer of technology, which includes green technology. Richer countries are also in a position of power and privilege to assist poorer nations to cope with natural disasters, where the already vulnerable are made more vulnerable. And on the right, gender justice activists foreground the question of gender in climate change, and in doing so, challenge the macro structures that sustain poverty, sexism, racism, homophobia, and transphobia. In that regard, gender justice activists argue that there is no climate justice without gender justice, and vice versa, that there is no gender justice without climate justice. And most of us find it, rather difficult or challenging to, as my younger nephew and niece would say, brain it. The unequal relationship among human persons, and we think of refugees and migrants, are intertwined with the hierarchical relationship of the human and non-human in the ecosystem. Not questioning the status quo impacts one's ecological care and concern. The intersection also recognizes that women are differently and disproportionately affected by climate change. So I'll move on now to the second part of the presentation, having unpacked the two intersections that I'm working with. The second intersection of climate justice and gender justice suggests why it is necessary to gender eco-theologies. Abrahamic faiths, such as Islam and Christianity, champion anthropocentrism, where the human is positioned at the center of creation. And an anthropocentric worldview is also an androcentric worldview where man has dominion not only over nature, but also women. So how useful is it then to work on the intersection of ecology and religions in one's ecological care and concern? We turn to ecofeminists, of course, who take up the question and provide an answer as they walk the talk. And I guess for those of us who are already identified as ecofeminists, just bear with me with the slide, which is also covered by the two speakers before me. So ecofeminism, for the uninitiated, is a term that's coined by Françoise Daubonne in the 1970s. It combines two words, ecological and feminism. Ecofeminists see a parallelism between men's domination of women and men's domination of nature. Ecofeminists celebrate women's affinity or closeness with nature and women's ecological care in nurturing not only the family, but also Mother Earth and Mother Earth's resources that, of course, sustain the human family. So in that sense, ecofeminist is often critiqued by feminists themselves as being essentialists in drawing on the fundamental binary of man-woman, men as having power over women, and men aligned with culture or production, where women are aligned with nature or reproduction. Ecofeminists attribute the accelerated drive towards growth, progress, and development as a kind of masculinist logics leading to maldevelopment or a sickness of the ecosystem. So Vandana Shiva, a distinguished ecofeminist from India, in her book Staying Alive, which still has a lot of traction, speaks of Prakriti, the feminine principle of creation in Hinduism, to emphasize the sacredness of all creation, rivers and mountains, because these are physical manifestations of gods and goddesses. Queer ecofeminism extends ecofeminist thought and praxis. It sees a parallelism between biodiversity or species diversity and gender and sexual diversity, and values both as having intrinsic worth. Queer ecofeminists show how within a heterosexist logic that flattens differences that matter, bodies, especially the female body, is commodified as preservable, most animals and plants as consumable, and queer bodies as disposable. So from a heterosexist logic, queer ecofeminists such as Greta Garth reclaim symbiosis or interconnectivity in rejection of oneness, sameness, and domination. Queer ecofeminists thus celebrate radical pluralism. An example is vegan feminists insisting on blurring the boundaries between human and non-human, where hard boundaries that separate human, non-human is the underlying logic that links sexism, racism, transphobia, and homophobia in our societies, including our faith communities. So for those of us who are Catholic, you'll be able to recognize the man on the left. That's our current Pope, Pope Francis. And I draw here in the next two slides from his encyclical on Laudato Si, Care for the Common Home. So to return to the question of why it is necessary to gender eco-theologies, we refer to Pope Francis's Laudato Si, meaning praise be to you, a papal letter on care for our common home. The encyclical letter comprises 6 chapters and 246 articles. Chapter 1, what is happening to our common home. Chapter 2, the gospel of creation. Chapter 3, the human roots of the ecological crisis. Chapter 4, integral ecology. Chapter 5, lines of approach and action. Chapter 6, ecological education and spirituality. It is not the only Christian source of ecological care, but it is arguably the most developed one within the Catholic tradition. And Pope Francis affirms his predecessors' visions, so he cites several popes. Pope St. John the 23rd, Pacem in Terris, more than 5 decades ago, exhorting world peace. He also cites from Pope Paul VI's reference to the ecological concern as a tragic consequence of unchecked human activity. St. John Paul II's call for a global ecological conversion to safeguard the moral conditions for an authentic human ecology, and Benedict XVI's recognition in Caritas in Veritate on integral human development. It further is a homage to St. Francis of Assisi, who shows how inseparable the bond is between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. This sets the tone for Pope Francis's confidence in humanity in building our common home. And this is a recurrent trope signifying the symbiotic nature-human relationship throughout the 6 chapters that thematically structure the encyclical letter. So there are 2 strong points that I want to foreground. The first of which is the papal encyclical's emphasis on an integral ecology, which calls for a conversion of hearts to bring about a holistic, and that is multi-sectoral, multi-level, multidisciplinary responses among key stakeholders that are meaningful and coordinated. So in that regard, it has a lot of resonance with the Sustainable Development Goals. Secondly, it emphasizes climate justice, where the Pope speaks out very strongly against ecological debt borne by poorer nations in the global south and labels such inequity as structurally perverse. He also advocates for common but differentiated responsibilities among the poorer and richer countries. And my critique is his silence on gender justice. So Laudato Si, as I would posit, is gender blind. Whilst differentiated responsibilities among nation states are noted and noteworthy, differentiated and disproportionate gendered impacts of climate justice and gender justice are not noted. Secondly, women theologians within the Catholic tradition, notably Rosemary Radford Ruther, an eco-feminist theologian, are not cited. So it's clear that male theologians cite other male theologians. And exclusive language continues to be used. So we have ecology of man rather than humanity. Secondly, Laudato Si is in part gender biased in the form of its heterosexist assumptions. It cautions us of the risk in cancelling out sexual difference between man and woman. This is actually at the heart of the Church's theology of the body. Pope Benedict XVI is cited emphasizing that the boundary of femininity and masculinity is necessary if we are going to be able to recognize ourselves in an encounter with someone who is different. In that regard, sexual difference is constructed as a precondition for a person's value and dignity. I find this problematic as it upholds heterosexism, which not only marginalizes but also devalues non-heteronormative bodies, and that is queer bodies and sexualities of LGBTIQ persons. I now move on to the third part of my presentation, which showcases instances where an integral ecology is glimpsed and the way these adds up to a queer proposal. So there are two narratives, and the first of which is by Jojo M. Fong, and the theme for this is creation as proliferation. So the image on the left is the cover of his book, and these are the notes from what I'm about to say. So creation as proliferation is the first theme. It is embodied in the eco-theology of Jojo M. Fong, who is a Malaysian Jesuit priest who has been initiated into Murut shamanism in Bantul village, which is located in southwestern Sabah in East Malaysia. At a personal level, Fong answered a vocational call to dialogue with indigenous peoples as part of his anthropological research and interest in interreligious dialogue, and consequently, he heeded the Lucan exhortation to put out into the deep, which gave him the boldness of heart to cross a significant threshold from the tangible world of indigenous culture into the unseen and little-known world of indigenous beliefs, shamanism. So Fong had to overcome fears of gory childhood ghost stories and testimonies of spirit possessions within the charismatic renewal of the Catholic Church in his teenage years to take this literal plunge. So it was a full immersion into the water, or rather the waters of a river. And the day after his initiation, Fong reflects on his baptism or immersion in the waters of Murut shamanism, and was told by the reputable Murut shaman who had initiated him that water spirits would come in the form of fireflies to watch over him, and they would be his personal guide. Feng's initiation into Murut shamanism is an initiation into the sacred, where the sacredness of the unseen world impinges on the visible world of animals, sea creatures, rivers, forests, jungle produce, land, and humankind. The indigenous belief that one creative spirit is present in the seen and unseen worlds, and that both space and time are sacred, defies modern logic of collapsing many worlds into the one world of neoliberal global capitalism, as shamanic logic believes that the human world is but one of many worlds. Fung works the hyphens of Catholicism, shamanism, seen and unseen worlds as priest-shaman himself. In doing so, he conceptualizes a liberation theology of sacred sustainability that is based on shamanic beliefs that an absolute being descends in aid of the oppressed people. Indigenous peoples, as the most disenfranchised in Malaysia, are furthermore protected by the sacred power of the spirits, and shamans that have the capacity to re-sacralize all spaces and beings. Violations that indigenous peoples face include state-driven deforestation, resulting in ancestral lands displacement without fair compensation. The ecological spirituality of sacred sustainability that flows from this liberation theology is furthermore grounded in the opening of one's body space to the point where it becomes increasingly borderless and porous, to being awed by the sacred mysteries of life. Our very breath that is filled with the sacred power of Ruach Elohim potentially sacralizes all of creation. The mysticism of a wholesome relationship in the human-earth sacred power Ruach nexus materializes. His shamanic theology of sacred sustainability in this non-Catholic sense queers Christian teachings in a sense of making these unfamiliar or strange, because that is the fundamental meaning of queer, and that is to make unfamiliar or strange. He challenges Christian anthropocentrism, the hierarchical ordering of creation with humans at the center of creation. Fung further queers pneumatology in blurring the boundaries of his body-spirit in deep relation with other bodies and spirits. And this has implications for what it means to do church in Asia, where Christianity is a colonial legacy. And so you can see from his theologizing and praxis that there is an immersion of Christianity into local cultures, traditions, and spiritualities. The second and final narrative comes from a Muslim laywoman. So from the member of a religious community, we move on to a very different person. And she belongs to a youth-led environmental group called My Hutan, literally meaning my forest. My Hutan is a group of Malaysian youths from various backgrounds united in the goal of preserving our forests, creating a prosperous Malaysia for the new generation. So this solidarity among youth is significant as race and religion are so heavily politicized in the context of Malaysia by politicians who are often, vying for votes, especially during elections. The second theme here is creation as materiality. It is resonant with an eco-feminist ethos that foregrounds materiality rather than abstraction. So eco-feminists pay attention to the materiality of waste management, consumptive patterns, and other ecological practices. City is a pseudonym. In this interview, speaks of the 3 R's, which we are familiar with: reduce, reuse, recycle. She campaigns for the preservation of forests and the care of stray dogs in the neighborhood. So this is significant as Muslims in Malaysia, at least most of them, tend to consider dogs as unclean animals. And on the intersection of feminism and ecological care, she says, feminism is tied to environmental activism because everyone needs the capacity. They need to have the platform to perform environmental activism on an equal level, because otherwise it will collapse either way. It won't be sustainable in the long run. Whether people realize it or not, women are needed to be the caregivers for nature. Of course, this doesn't exclude, the role and responsibility of men. On what sustains the eco-activism, she says, if you really are the caliphas of the world, then you have the duty to, take care of everything in it, and that's your responsibility. So I believe that through that faith to that belief, I have sustained my activism. So that's what Siti says. From this quotation, we may infer that Islamic anthropomorphism stems from the belief in one God, Tawhid, who is the creator. Creation, which is the natural world, is considered as Muslim, where animals in particular cannot but submit to God's will. Humans are created as stewards or khalifa, and not unlike in Christianity, humans hold a special position among creation as they are invested with the power to name. Bagir and Matiam argue that there is still hope for a plurality of interpretations within an Islamic anthropocentrism in the following ways. Firstly, an Islamic eco-theology, the human and non-human may occupy a spectrum of significance rather than a hierarchy of status. Secondly, many already appreciate the natural world beyond its utilitarian value and have moved on to its intrinsic value. And this happens when we view the natural world as subjects of spiritual contemplation and not just objects for our use and most of the time abuse. Finally, moving away from an Islamic anthropocentrism has implication for food ethics. Although meat is not forbidden to Muslims, there is room for an emergence of a Muslim vegetarian ethics. In these ways, there is a gap, a slippage between what the texts say and what Muslims do. In this liminal space lies the potential to queer theologies. In recognizing the plurality of interpretations in a quest to green religions, I argue that we potentially queer religions in the sense of moving away from doctrinal teachings of who the human is, its relationship to nature, and ultimately who God is, as the human is created in the image of God. As much as holy texts inform the ways we do ecology, the ways in which we do ecology can potentially reconstruct theology.
Dr. Bong, kindly
Yes,
note that you have 3 minutes to conclude the
yes,
presentation.
thank you. I'm concluding. So this is the Christian story revisited. And this is a queer proposal because we're revisiting the Christian story of creation. We ask, how does the story of who the triune God is and what this God does relate to the story of life on earth? The Christian story that is narrated in Laudato Si is noteworthy reference as it forms the basis of an integral ecology that separates the profound relationality of Christian and creator and creation. The story of who the triune God is in that compression of time-space has been God the Father as the absolute source of all, incarnated as the Son, and lives on through the breath of the Spirit permeating all creation. The three-person God that starts off and sustains the Christian story of creation begets a three-faceted sense of order. Firstly, order from chaos. Secondly, order as hierarchy. And finally, order as divine, where the Trinitarian structure that fills each creature reflects the glory of the interrelationality, yet differently ordered three persons. And in my final slide, this particular Christian story is only part of the Earth story. We call to mind Catherine Keller's Tehumic theology from her book Face of the Deep that reframes the mainstream Christian story by recuperating Tehum, the divine womb, that remains neither God nor not God, but the depth of God. A radical interdependence that arises not from a prior nothing between creator and creature would potentially designate creation as incarnation. And Ruach, despite 2 centuries of clerical misogyny, groans with creation in labor pains. The triune God as we know it is made fuzzy, disordered, and out of place. Creation becomes radicalized as chaotic, coextensive with the creator, and immanent. The fecund well-beings of Asian feminist eco-theologies and spiritualities resonate with Keller's Tehumic theology in offering transformative counter-narratives to the anthropocentric and androcentric worldview of the Christian story in Laudato Si. We do so by privileging creation as proliferation through the eco-theology of a Malaysian Jesuit priest-shaman. We do so by privileging creation as materiality through the narrative of a Muslim ecofeminist woman exploring the in-between space between what the texts say and what Muslims do. And all these serve to impregnate the Christian story of creation with differences that matter and matter that is different. And in this other queer beginning that goes beyond God, the Father, Son, and Spirit, lies integral hope. Thank you.